The morning sun spilled over the savannah, turning the tall grass into waves of molten gold as Eleanor Hayes planted her cane into the dry earth. The breeze carried the low moan of distant wildlife, but her attention narrowed to the single figure emerging from the shimmering horizon. A massive male lion stepped into the clearing with a slow, deliberate power that silenced even the wind. His tawny coat glowed beneath the rising light, and his thick mane, streaked with darker shades around the jaw, framed a face both majestic and fearsome. His amber eyes locked onto hers, bright and startlingly aware. Eleanor's breath steadied. She was 82, her joints aching from the long walk away from camp, but none of that mattered now. For a single suspended moment, she saw not the predator before her, but the frail cub she had once held against her chest, the tiny creature who had arrived on the verge of death 2 decades earlier. The memory flickered like a distant flame, fragile yet impossible to extinguish. The lion inhaled sharply, muscles rippling beneath his massive shoulders. Then he moved. He didn't stroll or approach with curiosity. He charged, a full sprint across the open grassland, each bound throwing dust into the air as 220 kilograms of pure muscle and instinct hurtled directly toward the small, silver-haired woman who did not step back. Behind her, faint in the distance, she could hear shouts. Rangers calling her name, commands yelled into radios, footsteps pounding against hard earth, but all of it sounded impossibly far away. Eleanor lifted her cane, holding it horizontally in front of her body, the way she had done countless times when a playful cub grew too bold. The wood felt familiar in her grip, worn smooth from years of use. The lion's mane streamed behind him as he closed the distance, his roar vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. She did not move. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had lost her mind after all, traveling halfway across the world to keep a promise made to a creature who might no longer remember her. But the doubt faded as quickly as it came. She had not come for guarantees. She had come because some vows were worth keeping, even when the world insisted they were foolish. 20 meters. 10. She could see the individual hairs along his muzzle, the dark ridges in his mane, the star-shaped marking between his eyes that no one else seemed to notice but her. 5 meters. The lion's roar cut through the morning air. Dust swirled. The rangers screamed for her to run. But Eleanor stood anchored in the golden light, her eyes steady, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came back," she said, and the lion thundered closer. The television flickered in the dim corner of Eleanor Hayes's small room at Rosebridge Nursing Home, casting shifting squares of pale blue light across the walls. It was nearly midnight, long past the hour when most residents had surrendered to sleep or the soft haze of evening medication. But Eleanor rarely slept well anymore. Her body ached from age. Her mind tugged constantly between restless memories and the heavy stillness of the present. She kept the TV on low volume just to keep the silence from swallowing her. The documentary playing tonight showed sweeping shots of the African savannah, the camera gliding over endless grasslands washed in the last light of dusk. She had meant to turn the television off an hour earlier, but something in the golden horizon held her attention. Then the lion appeared. He stepped into the frame with a confident, rolling stride, his mane catching the light like a slow-burning fire. The narration faded into a distant hum as Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She leaned forward, one trembling hand gripping the blanket as the camera zoomed in. Dust swirled around his paws. His amber eyes gleamed with a calm authority only fully grown males possessed. And there, between those eyes, was a marking, a faint but distinct star-shaped patch in the fur, darker than the surrounding coat. Not approximate, not coincidental, impossible to mistake. Eleanor pressed her fingertips to her lips. The room spun, not from age or fatigue, but from recognition so immediate it felt like a physical blow. Memories surged of a small cub barely strong enough to lift its head, of nights spent holding a fevered body against her chest, of tiny paws kneading her sleeve as he purred himself to sleep. She had traced that same star with her thumb when he fit easily in her arms. It was him. Her voice cracked as she whispered into the empty room. "My boy, you're alive!" Tears blurred her vision, sliding warm and sudden down her cheeks. She reached toward the screen, her fingers trembling as though she could touch him through the glass and years that separated them. The narrator droned on about conservation, poaching, population recovery, but none of it reached her. She saw only him, the lion she had saved, the one she had sworn to return to when he was grown and wild and free. "I promised," she murmured, breathless, "and I never forgot." For the first time in years, something sparked inside her, something bright, powerful, and undeniable: purpose. By the time the documentary ended, Eleanor had already made her decision. She reached for the phone beside her bed, her hand still shaking but her resolve firm. She was going back to Africa. The next morning, Eleanor dialed her granddaughter's number with hands that trembled more from urgency than age. It was barely 7 o'clock, and she knew Claire rarely rose early on weekends after long work weeks at the marketing firm. Still, this could not wait. Promises rarely did. Claire answered on the fourth ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Gran? Is everything okay?" "Darling," Eleanor said, steadying her breath, "I need your help with something important." A pause followed, the kind that implied concern, shading into suspicion. "What kind of important?" Claire asked. "I need to go to Africa," Eleanor replied, choosing not to soften the truth. "To Kenya, specifically, to a wildlife reserve." Another silence stretched across the line, longer this time. Eleanor pictured Claire sitting up in bed, brow furrowed, trying to decide if her grandmother had finally slipped into confusion. "Gran," Claire began gently, "you live in a care home. You can't just go to Africa. And why on earth would you want to?" "Because I saw him," Eleanor said, voice tightening. "The lion I cared for 24 years ago. He's alive, Claire. I saw him on a documentary last night. The star on his forehead, there's no mistaking it." "Gran," Claire exhaled, the word heavy with caution. "Are you sure it wasn't just a similar-looking animal? Lions don't live that long. Maybe this is—" "Claire Hayes," Eleanor interrupted, her tone suddenly sharp. "Do not patronize me. I may be old, but I am not confused. I spent 6 months in Africa caring for a dying cub. I fed him with a bottle every 2 hours. I slept beside him when he couldn't breathe. I traced that marking on his forehead every single day. I know him." The firmness in her voice startled even herself. 2 hours later, Claire arrived at the nursing home in jeans and an oversized sweater, her expression a mixture of worry and determination. She expected to find her grandmother disoriented or emotional. Instead, she found Eleanor fully dressed, sitting at a small table covered with photographs, letters, and official documents pulled from a dusty box. "Sit down, love," Eleanor said softly. "Let me show you." Claire sifted through the photographs. Eleanor, younger, sunburned, holding a tiny lion cub pressed against her chest, veterinary forms with African stamps, handwritten notes from field staff, a close-up photo of the cub's face, unmistakably showing the star-shaped marking. "This was him," Eleanor whispered. Claire swallowed hard. "Gran, this is real." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and now I must go back. Help me." Claire looked up, her eyes softening. "Then we're going together." Leaving Rosebridge Nursing Home turned out to be easier than either Eleanor or Claire expected. Most of the staff simply could not imagine an 82-year-old woman attempting something as reckless as fleeing the premises, let alone embarking on an intercontinental journey. Eleanor signed herself out against medical advice, a right she technically still held, though the nurses exchanged uneasy glances as Claire packed her grandmother's 2 suitcases and lifted them into a waiting taxi. Mrs. Patterson, the administrative director, followed them to the front entrance with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Mrs. Hayes, this is highly inappropriate. The travel, the climate, your medications, your age, it's all too much." "I'm well aware of my age," Eleanor said crisply. "I've been reminded of it every day for the last decade. But I am also aware that I survived a war, raised 2 children, buried a husband, and spent years helping wild animals return to their lives. I believe I can manage one more trip." Mrs. Patterson turned to Claire with pleading eyes. "Surely you can talk some sense into her." Claire gave a small, crooked smile. "Have you ever tried talking Gran out of anything once she's decided?" "No." "Then consider yourself lucky," Claire said. "It's much easier to help her do it safely." Inside the taxi, Eleanor looked back through the window. Several residents had gathered, faces pressed against the glass like children at a parade. Her closest friend, Dorothy, lifted a shaking hand and placed it against the pane. Eleanor pressed her own hand to the window in return, a silent goodbye neither woman wanted to acknowledge as final. The journey was grueling. 3 flights, 2 layovers, and an endless chain of airport lines that tested patience and endurance. Claire insisted on carrying all the bags, guiding her grandmother through terminals teeming with travelers. Eleanor insisted on walking without assistance, leaning only on her old wooden cane, the same one she had used decades ago to keep a mischievous cub from chewing on her boots. By the time they reached Nairobi, the heat wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. From there, a chartered jeep carried them deeper into the countryside. The landscape shifted from bustling city to scrubland to wide, sweeping plains painted with acacia trees. After 4 bone-rattling hours on unpaved roads, the jeep finally rolled to a stop before a cluster of low, sturdy buildings marked with the insignia of the Wildlife Reserve. Dusk settled over the land, turning the sky deep orange. Eleanor stepped out slowly, her joints stiff, but her eyes bright with purpose. Somewhere, out in that vast expanse of grass and shadow, lived the lion she had promised to return to. She had made it. And she wasn't going home without seeing him. The door of the reserve's main building swung open, just as Eleanor and Claire stepped from the jeep. 3 men emerged into the fading light, 2 younger wildlife rangers in khaki uniforms, and between them, a taller man with graying hair, a weathered jaw, and an air of quiet authority. His eyes, sharp and dark, swept over the unexpected visitors before he approached with measured steps. "I am Raphael Mbeki," he said in accented but fluent English, "director of this reserve. We are not scheduled for visitors. This is restricted land. How did you come to be here?" Eleanor tightened her grip on her cane, steadying herself not from fear, but from the significance of this moment. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she began. 24 years ago, I volunteered at the African Wildlife Rehabilitation Center to the south. I cared for an orphaned lion cub who was near death. He was released into the wild when he was about 8 months old. 3 days ago, I saw him in a documentary. The marking on his forehead is unique. Raphael's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, surprise flickering beneath his stoic exterior. He turned to one of the young rangers and spoke quickly in Swahili. The ranger immediately grabbed a radio and relayed the message. "You are the British nurse from the rehabilitation program," Raphael said, facing her again. "We have records mentioning a volunteer who saved a dying cub, one with an unusual marking. But, madam, with respect, you cannot be here. These lions are wild. This reserve is dangerous for unauthorized guests. I will have to arrange transport to send you back to the airport tomorrow morning." Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to be dismissed. "I came halfway across the world for one reason. I do not expect to touch him or approach him. I simply need to see him, even once, from a distance." "It is not possible," Raphael insisted. "We cannot lead guests into lion territory. It is against protocol and common sense. These animals are unpredictable." Claire stepped forward, protective instinct sharpening her voice. "Please, she came so far. Can you at least try?" Raphael sighed, the sound heavy with conflict. "And how do you propose I locate a single mature male in thousands of acres of wilderness? Lions are not waiting behind fences, ready for viewing." Eleanor said nothing more. She simply looked out toward the darkening plains, where the wind brushed through tall grass like a whisper of memory. The weight of her years pressed gently on her shoulders, yet she felt more alive than she had in decades. She had known this might be the answer, but she had not come all this way to surrender to it. Somewhere out there, the lion with the star on his forehead walked the savannah, and she would not leave without trying to find him. Night settled thick and silent around the guest quarters, broken only by the hum of insects and the distant calls of hyenas roaming beneath the moon. Claire had fallen asleep in the narrow bed beside the window, but Eleanor remained awake, staring out into the dark plains. The soft glow of starlight shimmered across the grass, and for a moment she imagined a small cub padding toward her, unsteady and unsure, yet stubbornly alive. Claire stirred. "Gran," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep, "tell me what it was really like." "The beginning," Eleanor inhaled slowly, gathering memories that time had softened but not erased. "The beginning," she repeated, letting her voice carry them both back across decades. "It was the hardest thing I had done since the war." She had been 58 when she arrived at the African Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, a place so remote that even the closest town was little more than a scattering of buildings. The center was underfunded and overworked, staffed by devoted biologists and veterinarians who did everything they could with what little they had. Eleanor had gone there because she needed something to wrench her out of the dull ache that had followed her husband's death. Her children loved her, but they were busy with their own lives. She needed to feel useful again. The cub arrived 3 weeks into her volunteering term. The rangers found him curled beneath a scrub bush, barely breathing, his ribs sharp beneath patchy fur. Poachers had killed his mother and 2 siblings. The cub had survived long enough only to succumb to exposure and pneumonia. When he was brought in, the veterinarian shook his head before even examining him. "We can try," he said softly, "but it may be kinder not to prolong things. He is far too weak." Eleanor had been cleaning out the warthog enclosure when she overheard the conversation. She approached the small examination room, drawn in by a mixture of instinct and something deeper, something she could not name. The cub lay on a rough blanket, sides heaving in shallow, labored breaths. His eyes were half closed, and when someone touched him, he gave a faint growl that was more fear than strength. She stepped closer. "Let me try." The staff exchanged doubtful looks. One of them said, "He'll bite." "I've been bitten before," Eleanor replied calmly, "and scratched, and yelled at, and threatened. I worked in battlefield hospitals. I can handle a sick lion cub." They let her try mostly because they didn't believe she would succeed. The first thing she did was sit beside him without touching him, lowering her voice to a soft, steady murmur. Not words, just tone. The same tone she had used with soldiers dying far from home, the same tone she used with her own children when they woke, frightened in the night. She stayed there for 6 hours, long after her legs went numb, and her back began to ache. But she didn't move, not until the cub's dull eyes shifted toward her, wary but aware. The next day, she brought warm broth, placing the bowl near him but leaving space so he didn't feel trapped. It took him 2 hours to gather enough strength and courage to crawl forward and taste it. Only a few swallows, but to Eleanor it was a victory as profound as any she had witnessed. On the 7th day, he allowed her to touch him. Her hand traveled gently across his fevered head, and she felt the tremor of pain still echoing through his fragile body. He leaned into her touch with a shuddering breath that broke her heart and repaired it in the same moment. She discovered the star-shaped marking there, faint but distinct, a cluster of darker fur directly between his eyes. She traced it lightly, and the cub exhaled a soft, rumbling purr that vibrated against her palm. When nights grew cold, she carried her sleeping bag into his enclosure and slept beside him, his small body pressed against her side like an oversized house cat desperate not to be alone. The staff thought she was out of her mind, but they didn't stop her. They watched as the cub's breathing steadied, as his appetite returned, as he began to wrestle her shoelaces with clumsy determination. It was then that the cane became necessary. At 3 months old, he had sharp teeth and an alarming enthusiasm for chewing anything that moved. Eleanor found an old walking cane leaning forgotten in a corner. She used it to redirect him when his play grew too rough, tapping the ground lightly to guide him away. The cane became his favorite toy, a kind of game between them. He lunged for it. She lifted it just out of reach. He pounced again. She laughed, despite herself. 6 months later, he was too large to remain at the center. His paws had grown as big as her hands, his coat now thick and healthy. His mane had begun to darken at the edges, foreshadowing the magnificent male he would one day become. But the star between his eyes remained constant, a perfect reminder of the fragile creature she had once held. The night before his release into the protected reserve, he curled up beside her again, though he was nearly too big for such closeness. His head settled on her shoulder, heavy and warm. She stroked the star marking and whispered into the dark, "You're going to be magnificent, and someday, when you're truly free, I'll come back. I promise." It was a vow she made with no expectation she could ever fulfill it. But some promises, Eleanor had learned long ago, were worth making simply because the heart demanded it. Morning light filtered through the small window when Eleanor awoke to the sound of hurried footsteps outside the guest quarters. Claire was already sitting up. Tension etched across her face as voices rang out short, clipped commands in Swahili, mixed with the metallic clatter of equipment being gathered. A brisk knock sounded before the door opened, and Director Raphael Mbeki stepped inside, his expression grim. "There is a situation," he said. "Poachers have been spotted in the northern sector." Claire stiffened. "What does that mean?" "It means they are inside the reserve," Raphael replied. "Armed, experienced, likely hunting lions or elephants. We detected fresh tracks and a breach in the outer fencing. My team is preparing to move out immediately." Eleanor pushed herself upright, her heart tightening in her chest. "The northern sector," she said quietly. "Isn't that where he lives?" Raphael hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, the mature male with the star marking. If he is the same lion you cared for, his territory lies there." Claire turned sharply to her grandmother. "Gran, no, don't even think about it." But Eleanor was already standing, gripping her cane with a steadiness that belied her age. "Poachers killed his mother. They nearly killed him before he ever had a chance. I will not let them harm him again." Raphael shook his head. "Absolutely not. You cannot come with us. This is a tactical operation, dangerous even for armed rangers." "You need eyes," Eleanor countered. "Someone who knows how to track quietly, Someone who understands this reserve better than you assume. I studied these maps for 6 months when I worked here. I know how poachers think, and I know how lions move." One of the younger rangers scoffed under his breath. "She will slow us down. She could get herself killed." But another ranger, older, with deep lines carved across his face, spoke up. "I once saw an elephant return to a woman who saved it as a calf," he said. 15 years later, animals remember kindness. This lion may trust her more than any of us." Raphael exhaled, the weight of responsibility heavy in his stance. "Fine," he said at last. "You may come, but you stay inside the vehicle. You obey every command immediately, and if danger arises, we retreat. Do you understand?" "I do," Eleanor said. Within minutes, they were bouncing across the savannah in a reinforced patrol truck, dust rising behind them like smoke. Claire sat beside her grandmother, gripping the door handle through every jolt. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "Yes," Eleanor replied, watching the vast plains roll past. "I do." Some promises demanded action, even when danger lay ahead. By the time the Rangers returned to headquarters at dusk, frustration clung to the air like heat. They had found snares, boot prints, and signs of a camp hastily abandoned, but the poachers themselves had slipped away into the vast sprawl of bushland. The threat remained, heavy and unresolved. Eleanor was exhausted. Her body ached from the jolting ride and the long hours of tense watching, but she had proven herself useful, spotting a camouflaged snare the younger rangers had missed, and identifying an unnatural break in the brush line that suggested a lookout point. Even Raphael grudgingly admitted her presence had helped, but none of that brought her closer to the lion. Claire helped her settle into the guest quarters, arranging pillows, preparing water, urging her to rest. "Gran, please, you've pushed yourself enough today." Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the small window into the deepening night. "I didn't come here to be careful," she murmured. "I came to keep a promise." The sky darkened, the stars emerging like scattered embers. Claire eventually drifted into sleep, but Eleanor remained awake, listening to the soft rustle of wind moving through distant grass. She was about to lie down when a sound broke through the quiet so faint she wondered if she had imagined it. A heavy, deliberate step, then another. A low vibration hummed through the glass. Eleanor rose slowly, her breath caught between fear and recognition. She moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain. In the pale light of the moon, the savannah looked like an ocean of silver, and cutting through that silver were tracks fresh, massive, unmistakable, pressed deeply into the dirt, only feet from the building. Lion tracks. Her heart hammered. The prints led directly to the window where she stood. She looked out across the plains, searching the shadows. She didn't see him, but something inside her stirred with certainty. He had been there. He had come to her. Not coincidence, not chance. Recognition. Eleanor glanced at Claire sleeping soundly, unaware. Stepping quietly, she lifted her coat from the chair and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her cane stood leaning against the wall. She took it gently, feeling its familiar weight settle into her palm. Outside, the night air bit at her cheeks as she stepped into the moonlit clearing. The world felt impossibly still, as though holding its breath. She followed the tracks, each one a silent invitation into the tall grass bordering the reserve. Behind her, she faintly heard Claire stirring, then a sharp, panicked voice calling her name. But Eleanor did not stop. Somewhere ahead, waiting beyond the shadows, was the lion she had loved and lost and never forgotten, and she was going to him. Dawn crept across the savannah in slow strokes of blue and gold as Eleanor followed the trail of prints through the whispering grass. Each step pressed deeper into the earth than her own, each one steady and purposeful, leading her farther from the compound and closer to the heart of lion territory. The air smelled of dust and morning chill, a scent she remembered from another lifetime. Behind her, calls echoed Claire's frightened voice, Raphael's stern commands, the rangers gathering in alarm, but they faded beneath the thrum of her heartbeat. She walked as though guided by something older than fear, older than reason, something she had carried for 24 years. The grass parted ahead, revealing a shallow clearing washed in the first light of day. Eleanor stopped at its edge, breath caught in her chest. The plain spread open like an untouched canvas, save for one set of tracks leading across it. She followed them with her eyes until they vanished into a shadowed rise of earth. Then he appeared. He stepped from behind a cluster of thorn trees with the silent assurance of a king returning to his throne, a massive male lion, broader and more powerful than any she had seen in her youth. His mane, thick and rippling, framed his head in dark gold. His coat shimmered with morning light, and his powerful shoulders rolled beneath it with each deliberate step. But it was his eyes, those amber eyes, that held her still. And there, between them, lay the star-shaped marking she had traced with her finger when he was small enough to fit in her lap. They stared at one another across the clearing. The world held its breath. Then the lion moved, not with curiosity, not with hesitation. He charged, his paws thundering against the ground, sending sprays of dust into the air. His mane streamed behind him like a banner, and his roar broke through the skies, deep, resonant, primal. Behind Eleanor, voices screamed. She heard Claire's cry, Raphael's order to stand down, the metallic snap of safeties being disengaged. But none of it touched her. She did not run. She lifted her cane, planting it firmly in the earth before her, holding it horizontally at waist height, the same gesture she had used countless times when a playful cub had barreled toward her with more enthusiasm than caution. The wood was steady in her hands, familiar, unchanged. The lion closed the distance. 20 meters, 10, 5. She could see the glint of his teeth, the flare of his nostrils, the wild power coiled inside his stride. She could smell the sun-warmed dust in his mane, the raw scent of the wild clinging to him. Then, at the final instant, he stopped, not gradually, but in a sudden, skidding halt that sent dust exploding around them. His massive paws dug deep into the ground, furrows ripping through the earth. The force of it sent a spray of dirt across her coat and hair, but she did not flinch. He stood only 2 meters away, towering above her, his breath hot and rhythmic, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity she felt in her bones. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, not a threat, but recognition. He lowered his head, slowly, deliberately. Then he reached forward and gently closed his jaws around the end of her cane, not biting, not pulling, holding. The same game they had played when he was a tiny, stubborn cub refusing to stay out of her pockets. Eleanor's breath broke on a laugh, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. "You remember?" she whispered. "Oh, my beautiful boy. You remember?" The lion released the cane and stepped closer, his massive body brushing against her legs with surprising gentleness. He lowered himself into the dust beside her, tucking his body against her knees, as though reclaiming a place he had never forgotten. His head rested on the ground near her hip, amber eyes soft, unguarded. A deep, resonant purr rolled from his chest. Eleanor sank carefully to her knees, ignoring the sting in her joints. She placed a trembling hand on his head and traced the familiar star between his eyes. "You found me," she murmured. Behind them, the rangers lowered their weapons, stunned into silence. Claire collapsed to her knees, sobbing in disbelief. Eleanor leaned forward, her forehead touching the lion's. "I kept my promise," she said. and the savannah seemed to exhale along with her. The sun had risen higher by the time Raphael and the rangers dared cross the clearing. None of them spoke. None wanted to break whatever fragile miracle was unfolding before them. The massive lion lay pressed against Eleanor's legs, his breathing slow and steady, his purr rolling like distant thunder. Eleanor kept her hand on his mane, her fingers moving gently through the thick fur as though afraid the moment might dissolve if she stopped. Then she saw it, a dark stain spreading across the lion's shoulder. Blood. Her heart clenched. "Raphael," she called, her voice tight. "He's hurt." The rangers froze, unsure whether approaching would trigger aggression, but the lion remained still, unthreatened so long as Eleanor's hand rested against him. Raphael carefully raised binoculars and examined the wound. "A bullet graze," he said grimly. "Fresh. Likely from the poachers." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Bring me medical supplies." Raphael blinked. "We need to sedate him. A lion will not tolerate treatment awake." "He will tolerate me," Eleanor said softly. "He always has." The lion turned his head at the sound of her voice. Lifting it just enough that his amber eyes met hers, she traced the star on his forehead with her thumb, and he exhaled, a deep, rumbling sigh. Raphael hesitated, then signaled his team. Minutes later, rangers arrived with a field medical kit. They remained at a safe distance as Eleanor sorted through disinfectant, bandages, antibiotics. Claire watched from behind Raphael, tears still drying on her cheeks. Eleanor whispered to the lion as she worked, "This will sting, love, but I need you to trust me again." She poured disinfectant over the wound. The lion growled, muscles tensing beneath her hands, but he did not strike. He lowered his head to the ground, purr fading into a low rumble of discomfort. The rangers gripped their rifles. Eleanor pressed her hand more firmly to the star marking, her voice steadying. "You're all right. I'm here." Gradually, the lion's body eased again. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied ointment, and wrapped the shoulder in a makeshift bandage that would survive dust, heat, and movement. When she finished, he lifted his head and pressed it gently against her hand, as though offering thanks. The clearing remained silent. No one had ever witnessed anything like it. Days later, a decision was made. Raphael called Eleanor and Claire into his office, where maps and photographs covered the walls. "We are building a new observation station in the northern sector," he said, "near his territory, a place for long-term monitoring. If you wished, Mrs. Hayes, you could stay there during our peak season as a consultant." Claire's mouth fell open. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You mean I could stay near him?" "If he chooses to remain nearby," Raphael said. "Lions are wild, but it seems he has chosen you." The station was completed by the start of the dry season. A small cabin with sturdy walls, a wood stove, and wide windows facing the expanse of golden plains. Eleanor moved in with only a suitcase, her medications, and her old wooden cane. Claire stayed 2 weeks to ensure she settled comfortably before returning to England to rearrange her life with new purpose. On Eleanor's first night alone, he came. The lion appeared at dusk, a silent silhouette against the dying sun. He approached the cabin slowly, circling once before lying down just outside the door, his mane stirring in the warm wind. Eleanor sat on the small porch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to his steady breathing. So it continued. Through 3 full seasons, he visited her sometimes daily, sometimes after long absences when he returned from patrols or hunts. He slept outside her door, followed her at a distance when she walked near the station, and rested his head on her knees whenever she sat on the porch. She documented his behavior, taught new rangers how to read lion signs, and lived more fully than she ever had. But time, as always, moved forward. At 85, her health began to fade. She returned to England under Claire's care, carrying a lifetime of memories and the photograph of a lion with a star between his eyes. Months later, she passed in her sleep, peaceful and unafraid. 3 days after Eleanor Hayes died, rangers in the northern sector found the lion lying in a quiet patch of sunlit grass near the observation station. He seemed simply to be resting. He never rose again. They buried him the same day Eleanor was laid to rest, a world apart yet impossibly connected. And those who believe in such things say that somewhere beyond the horizon, an old woman and a great lion walk side by side across endless golden plains, keeping each other company the way they were always meant to, wild, free, and forever unbroken.